All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Milwaukee City Hall for today's public records training. We have with us folks from the State Archives and the Public Records Advocate here with us today. A few housekeeping items for those in the room. Restrooms are downstairs. Please sign in the hallway. Also, if you're watching online, please be sure to email Ginger to make sure we can capture that you were participating in the training. So, we'll hear from Matt Brown with the State Archives. He's been with the State Archives for 14 years, and he'll talk about records retention. After Matt, we'll hear from our new public records advocate, Ginger McCall, who was appointed by the governor earlier this year. She'll talk to how to respond to public records requests. And for those in the room, please feel free. We'll take, Ginger and Matt will take questions throughout the event. I'll have a handheld mic. We'll just want to make sure your question gets captured on the mic because we're recording this, and it'll be available on the city's YouTube channel afterwards. And if you're watching live and you want to email a question, you can email Ginger, and we'll try to see if we can't get your question answered during the session. So with that, welcome to Milwaukee, and I give you Matt Brown.
Thanks, Scott. I am here from Secretary of State Archives Division, aka the Oregon State Archives, and today we're going to be talking about public records retention and public records law basics when it relates to records retention. So we're going to walk through what is a public record, and also what are your responsibilities for managing public records and the best methods for retaining them to comply with the law. All right, so at State Archives, we have a couple main functions. The first one is we run the reference room where the permanent records of Oregon State government are preserved and made accessible. We also have the publications unit, which publishes the Oregon Blue Book and the Oregon Administrative Rules. And then there's my unit, Records Management, where we provide advice and assistance to agencies on request about how to keep records. And we also spend a lot of our time these days with our electronic records management system project. It's called ORMS, and it automates a lot of these retention and records destruction issues that we'll be talking about today. All right, a couple quick slides to give you the foundation of public records law in Oregon. Straight to the statute, ORS 192. Defines public record. It has changed in the last several years. Our definition of public record used to be a laundry list of different types of records or formats or storage media for records. Nowadays, it's a more generic definition that you want things to meet all three of these conditions listed in the law for something to be considered a public record for the purposes of retention. So first of all, something needs to be in the possession of or created or received by a public agency, and that could be a state agency, a local agency, cities, special districts, pretty much any entity that gets taxpayer dollars. So Part A is basically, does it exist in some tangible format that you can see or touch? Part B, is this information public related to an agency's ability to fulfill its public function? And Part C, does it have is it necessary to satisfy some kind of requirement or need of the public agency? We don't retain records or documents that don't fulfill some kind of need for our agency, that don't help us do our jobs. And then also at the bottom of the slide, the technology or medium that information is held in at this moment is irrelevant to whether it's considered a public record or not. Formats are very changeable. If it's in paper form, you can slap it on a scanner and make it electronic, or vice versa. You can print out something. As long as the information itself isn't changed, the retention will be the same regardless of what form or format or storage media it happens to be in at that moment. So again, something would have to meet all three of these criteria listed on this slide to be considered a public record. So the public records law applies to public related work done anywhere, in any physical location, on any type of account, whether that's a personal account, work account, a device kept at home, a device that you bought with your own money. All of those devices can and sometimes do hold public records. So that's why we avoid commingling our work with our personal information whenever possible, because those kinds of things that end up in a work account or on your work calendar technically could be requested and made accessible to the public. There are exemptions to types of information that can be disclosed, and Ginger will be talking about that more in her talk. So again, whether we decide something is a public record or not, it has nothing to do with the technology or format that it's in right now. It's only content that matters. Whether the content relates to a public employee or fulfilling a public function of government. And also, you want to avoid using personal email accounts for work and vice versa, probably, to keep yourself and your agency out of trouble. The content is what drives retention and access requirements to public records. So we've decided what is a public record. And does every public record need to be kept forever? Luckily, the answer is no. The courts have realized that no public agency has the resources to keep every scrap of information indefinitely. And so that's where a records retention schedule comes in. We just call them schedules. So a schedule is a list of records and tells you how long you have to keep them. In some cases, it will describe the types of records that might be included under that entry. And it will have hopefully a nice, clean, concise, easy to follow retention period after it, so that you know when you can destroy records that fall under that category. So your retention schedule is the only legal authorization that you need to destroy public records. You don't have to get local approval, or if you work with a federal agency, you don't have to get their approval. Our Secretary of State retention schedules should encompass all of those varying requirements and put them in a nice, easy package so that you can follow them and know when your records can be destroyed. When we write a retention schedule, we always work in collaboration with the regulated agencies to get their input, because our knowledge of records held by a city, for example, are pretty much a mile wide and an inch deep. We don't work with those records on a day-to-day basis. We don't know the city's detailed requirements for keeping them, and so that's why we want regulated agencies to weigh in to help us issue these retention schedules so that they can be signed off on not only by state archives, but by a committee of agencies affected. We do take into account 4 categories of possible record value, and those are administrative, which is just business need, how long you need information to do your job. Legal need, in that case, possibly the courts or the legislature have weighed in on how long records need to be kept. Fiscal, and that just means audit value. Our auditor is going to be requesting accounting records, for example, and for how long will they be requesting them? How far back? And finally, historical requirements. So we weigh those different types of requirements and needs, and in collaboration with, in this case, the cities, write a retention schedule that will comply with all of those requirements. The schedules are signed off by, like I said, committees and by the state archives before they're valid. They are on a review cycle, so the schedules are dynamic. They do change because cities change and their missions, and the records that document those missions also change. And then finally, the city's schedule can be found. We usually just have people Google the phrase OAR 166, and that'll take you to a list of general schedules. If you want the specific citation for cities, it's OAR 166-200. And that will list, that is the general schedule for all Oregon cities. So it doesn't mean that every city has to keep every record on that schedule list. But if you do hold them in any form, then that's your authorization to destroy them. A couple years ago, we did modernize our OARs related to electronic records retention. And some of those rules included how records can be scanned and made accessible rather than the paper version. As far as the electronic servers go, what file formats should they be kept in, what kind of security should there be on the system, how should the system be maintained. But one of the main reasons for updating the rules was to set rules for electronic records management systems, which are a very specific set of software that can help agencies manage their records that are born digital for the most part, and make it so you don't have to then print anything out or convert them to another form, or look through file rooms of records to provide access to them when they're requested by courts or the public. And we'll talk a little bit more about ERMSs later in the presentation, but in case you haven't looked at the OAR 166 in the last 2 years or so, there have been some updates. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit now that we have the legal framework established. We're also going to talk about how we handle these records that are in our care, in our custody. So what we're all really good at is storing. We're good at creating records, right? And then we're also really good at putting it in a pile somewhere, or putting it in folders, dumping it somewhere. So we're great at storing things, but storage is only a tiny fraction of the battle. What we really need to look at is how are we organizing the records that we're storing so that we can find them again, provide access to them when they're requested, and ultimately to destroy them when the retention schedule says that they can't be destroyed. Okay, a couple of visuals here on the screen where we're going to talk a little bit about, how records tend to be organized. So for decades and decades, records were stored in centralized file rooms in paper form. So this is our old, mostly decommissioned state archives file cabinet of all our old projects. So we no longer add to this. We are digitizing these and putting them in our ERMS system so that we can get the space back. First of all, we don't have to hold on to all of this paper. But typical office file cabinet, it's a bunch of drawers. Each drawer has a whole bunch of file folders in it, and the file folders have labels, and they have other notation. They're sorted by defined criteria. In this case, it's alphabetically by the name of the agency that we worked with. These are retention schedule files for agencies. And this kind of organization is really how paper records were filed for decades. The basic structure, it makes sense to people. It's second nature for most people who work in any kind of office. Now think about this cabinet and then replicate it electronically so that you have nested folders on a shared drive. That's pretty much what happened in the last 20 or 30 years. So you have a network drive that all kinds of people have access to. If there was a gatekeeper to a centralized file room, that person is now gone. Everyone makes up their own file structure and their own naming convention. So the structure pretty quickly gets messed up. Suddenly everyone has the ability to create new folders or new headings whenever we can't find what we want. And as things grow, that's going to happen very, very often. So there's no longer experts on the file plan or the file structure. And so over time, as new people come on board, maybe training lapses, people forget what certain things, what certain acronyms mean. And this slow, gradual slide usually leads to something like this. If we're looking at replicating a paper file structure in a network drive, it's probably going to look something like this. This pretty much looks like every network file share that I've ever seen, and that is not to judge anyone who works in them. It's just that network drives are not the optimal way to store public records in a shared environment. It's just because even the most carefully planned file structure will eventually break down without pretty much constant oversight and maintenance. And people are way too busy doing their regular jobs to be able to take time out to go tame this wild shared drive. So you can notice some of these file folder titles are acronyms. There's AA lowercase, there's ADA uppercase, there's HRD, and then there's my personal favorite, Frank's stuff. So that doesn't really tell you anything about the contents other than Frank was somehow involved. So you can see from the example, and you can probably recognize your own agency shared drive if you still have one from this. You can see a few folders that do make sense given that previously established structure. So there's folders for things like forms and background checks and recruiting. But there's tons of acronyms. You know, someone on their first day is not going to know where to file things. It's not going to make intuitive sense. And pretty much the only way you're going to find a document that you're looking for in this mess is if you already know exactly where it is and you don't mind drilling down through a folder structure. Also, there's probably going to be lots of duplicate content somewhere in this because people really like to stash extra copies of records or make copies of whole directories and file them somewhere else so that they know exactly where to find them. They don't trust any kind of centralized organization anymore. So what we're left with is this network file structure where it's impossible to proactively apply any sort of retention rules to this because the information simply is not organized in a way that makes that possible. And so everything has to be manual. You have to go and find it yourself, and you have to hope that your knowledge of the file folders is good enough to get you there. So we don't want things to be manual and electronic. We want it to be automated. We want the electronic systems to do the heavy lifting for us and help us. So there really does have to be a better way to do this. And this is just not to put too fine a point on it, what some of these folders can look like if it was too small of a view on the previous slide. Miscellaneous folders always pop up. It doesn't help people find things. The question mark is another that we've seen a lot, and untitled. No one even took the time to name the folder that they created and filed documents in. So what do we learn from all of our years of attempting to do this type of records management in our light-speed electronic world that we live in now? A few key lessons that we've come up with, and the first one is we just have to simplify. If you have too many choices of file folders, people are going to refuse to make the choice. And it's kind of human nature. And we've seen studies where if you ask someone to sort things into one of 25 categories, they're just going to look at you like you're crazy. If you give them a dozen choices, they'll probably make a game attempt and then give up. But if you give them 5 or 6, it becomes a fairly easy and routine thing. If you give them a limited number of choices, in effect, a functional filing system, which is based on the functions of the agency as the main categories, that really lessens the burden on the employees, and it makes things a lot easier to identify. So once we have functional categories, for example, accounting or payroll, next we need to identify subcategories to those functions. So underneath accounting, we would probably have one for invoices and a separate category for accounts receivable records. And each of those subcategories matches an entry in the general schedule. And each general schedule entry has its own retention period. So in that sense, what we've got is a fairly flat directory structure. At the bottom level are categories that match the retention schedule. And the retention schedule is applied to the folders. So we load our retention schedules into the system, and then once someone puts a document in a certain folder, the system knows how long the contents of that folder need to be kept, and it can easily tell you, based on the metadata, date created, for example, on a document, the destruction date for that document. So that is something that can help people when it's time to do your annual purge of your records. It means you don't have to open every file folder and every file cabinet and look at the document and look at its date and make a manual decision on whether it can be destroyed or not. The system already has that information at its available and can identify records that can be destroyed. It won't destroy them without human intervention, but it can identify what is eligible for destruction and make purging a lot quicker and more efficient. So we want to create folders based on retention periods of like records, and to put invoices all in the invoices folder. So we don't want to have forever piles of miscellaneous documents. Probably the biggest lesson here is that official records, public records, they all need to be filed in the same central areas. It could be a centralized file room, or it could be an electronic system used in common by the entire agency. But what we wouldn't want to have is the 10 employees in our department to all scatter their public records on 10 different personal workstations. That's not a centralized approach, and it means when people need records, they're going to need to somehow get access to those 10 machines. With 10 people that all probably have their own naming convention and probably have their own unique file structure. So the goal here is really to centralize and to control, to have intellectual control over our records. That means having them in one central location. So extra copies laying around are probably not going to be disposed of properly. You need to make sure that the official copy is there's version control, that people know which is the latest version, and not, draft number 2 from 3 weeks ago. So that people aren't relying on those drafts and copies laying around. They're going to the centralized filing system and identifying the latest official copy of a document. And also our personal drives should really only have non-record materials, reference materials, unfinished drafts, scratch notes, and things like that that really aren't public records, don't meet the definition of public records. So again, the functional filing system has a limited number of categories, so people don't get overwhelmed, so that they will actually make the choice to file. The functional filing system is organized by broad functional areas. Like we said, one might be law enforcement, another might be human resources. Within those functional areas, we group them by retention requirements. They're in folders, not just piles of documents that are kept forever. And finally, records go into the same areas, the centralized approach, and not into personal folders. So this slide shows you what taking those approaches, the functional filing system, and applying them to that messy old shared drive might look like. So now you can see we actually gave it a naming convention. At the top, you can tell this is the Human Resources Administration function. And within that, we've got things like subcategories like benefit records. And within that, we've got categories of records that all have retention periods. In this case, we went ahead and put the retention period on the folder name. Just as a tip, you don't want someone putting very ephemeral short-term records in the 75-year folder, so why not put it there? It's not necessary to do that. And then they further broke them down by year. That makes it a lot simpler. Sometimes, if you have a large volume of records, you can just file them in the appropriate category and then in the year, and then everything in that year folder can usually go away around the same period of time. It makes destruction a little bit simpler. So this slide is what a filing system might look like if we followed our advice. And the records are actually the same. That shared drive we were looking at before did contain personnel records. Now it's just makes a little bit more rational sense. People can figure out what's going on with this structure. Okay, once you've established your new clean filing system, what is really there to stop us from falling into our bad habits again? Well, a couple things. A well-organized training program and good unit level procedures are probably going to help. And reaching consensus among employees will help. But usually what happens is things get busy at work and the practices slip. So over time, we start to approach this same mess that we had at the beginning. To avoid that, we really need to bring in new tools. that automate our simple routine decisions, and that also lessen our reliance on expecting every single person to do the correct thing 100% of the time. So this is where the ERMS, electronic record system, can help us. It can take some of the burden off our employees. So electronic records management system, it can be used to locate and manage not just electronic records, but also paper records as far as where they're located. For one example, Secretary of State Audits Division uses our electronic records management system, we call it ORMS, to organize their audit reports. They just drag and drop electronic copies of their audit reports into the correct folder in the system. They can also put email, other research documents in there. And if they don't have electronic documents but they do have 10 boxes related to an audit, they can just enter into the system the physical location for where the boxes are stored. So if they search for that audit name or number, they're going to get a list of results, including scanned electronic documents and also the physical locations of some of the boxes. And so they'll know exactly where to look for all the records. There aren't 5 or 6 systems. There aren't some in paper, some in electronic. If they're public records at our agency, they're meant to be added into our system in one way or another. And that means retrieval can be done by one search in one system, rather than having IT look in one place, sending people to the offsite storage to pull boxes, and having everyone search their email. That's kind of a recipe for disaster, given the volume of records that are coming into our agencies these days. The main reason for ERMS is that manual records management simply doesn't work in our electronic world. There's too much volume. People will say, why don't we just go the cheap route and have people do their jobs like they always did in paper? Or try to apply those paper processes to electronic records. So there's a lot of evidence to reinforce that manual records management just isn't going to work in the electronic world. We create mountains of digital information daily, and even if everyone devoted half their time at work to managing it, we still wouldn't get to it all. To accommodate this huge volume of records, there are really no physical reminders that spur us into action. A while back, we probably have all of our project folders in paper in file folders on our desk, and we could tell when it got to our eye level, it was really time to do something about all of that stuff. And so it was kind of a reminder, reminding us to do something right in front of our eyes. But nowadays, we just create another folder on our desktop or in our shared drive. There's no reminder. You can easily ignore that kind of stuff forever. We also create huge numbers of duplicate copies or electronic information, and a lot of it is simply uncontrolled. If we just think about every time that we collaboratively work on a document with a large group of people, you probably recognize that you're emailing documents back and forth constantly. Hey, what do you think of this draft? How many versions are there going to be of these documents? So what happens now is, instead of one document, we've got a whole slew of documents that we have to manage for every specific document. And it's really impossible to reliably make sure you destroyed all the copies when it's time. So security also gets a lot tougher when you have to apply rules to so many different silos of information. There are always going to be lapses. And in that case, your agency could be put at risk, legal risk, or financial risk. Without centralized control of information, it's a lot harder to find and produce it when you're facing legal discovery requests or public records requests from the public. So the times that you have to spend looking for those records, the lawyer fees, the redaction fees, they can all really add up. And then finally, electronic records, they need pretty constant monitoring over time to ensure that they're going to stay accessible and readable. Our file formats do change a lot, and what's working for us today might not work in 10 or even 5 years from now. We really need to understand what we hold, what information we hold, to be able to prepare for the future. In an ERMS system, it's going to allow us to track all of our information with a single search. So what options do government agencies in Oregon have regarding their electronic records management system? Agencies are allowed to select their own system, provided it meets the requirements in OAR 166 Division 17, the slide we looked at earlier. And especially important is any ERMS selected by an agency must be certified to meet the U.S. Department of Defense 5015.2 standard. It's a standard for electronic record keeping systems. This standard ensures security and interoperability and portability of data stored within systems. And software that is not DoD certified is not approved for permanent storage of government records. So there's no mandate for an agency to acquire one of these systems, but if you do acquire one, it needs to be on the DoD 5015 list, product registry list. Agencies in Oregon have the unique opportunity to join our statewide ERMS system, again called ORMS, a public-private partnership that is facilitated between state archives and Shavs Consulting in Baker City, Oregon. So it's a software as a service model, a private government cloud where agencies pay a monthly subscription fee, and then they're able to implement that ERMS without the significant infrastructure costs associated with a standalone system. They also get the benefit of state archive staff, and we help people organize and manage their records proactively and conduct training at people's desks on the best ways to use the software. At the moment, I think it's about 60 state and local government agencies part of ORMS, from the smallest school district and special district up to larger courts, cities, counties, and state agencies. All right, to shift gears again, we're going to talk a little bit about modern technologies for record keeping, including the old shoe phone. The main, probably, technology that people use, we're going to talk about is email, which is hardly new. It's been around since the 60s, but by the 90s, it was something everyone was using for pretty much all their business communications. That's pretty much 25 years of ever-increasing percentage of business communications using this platform. So you'd think by now we'd have all the answers right in our palm of our hand, right? But unfortunately, email systems are not really meant for long-term storage of records. They really should be moved out of the email system. Email systems were designed as, an ephemeral contrivance. For most of its life, they weren't seen as important records. And a lot of people in government and business were very hesitant to treat it as a proper record-keeping technology for a really long time. So as a result, we still struggle with just how to deal with all of these business communications that are sent by email. So some of the issues with email are, again, exploding volume. Every year, the number of email correspondence increases, and the percentage that's spam also increases every year. So need to talk about some of the other drawbacks that it has as a format. How long our emails are kept often depend on external factors. IT shops run out of server space and say it's time to start destroying email. We're at our quota. Well, technically, emails are public records that can only be destroyed on the authority of a retention schedule. So there's a little bit of a conflict there. IT policies might be in conflict with records management policies. A lot, but not all, of your email will fall under public record, especially if they're duplicates, or if you're just CC'd or something on it, or if it's reference material. Those would not fall under public record. And also there's this question of how long are we supposed to keep emails? And state archives cannot make a blanket statement about that, unfortunately, since the content of the conversations, the content of the email message itself is going to determine its retention, not its format. So there have been some government agencies that, for example, said, we're going to keep all our email 60 days and then destroy it. Well, not a good idea because, legally binding contracts are in the statute as being kept 6 years after expiration of contract. If it was sent in an email and you destroyed it after 60 days, there's going to be a problem. So email, again, is a communications transmission medium, but it's not meant to be a long-term storage solution. So attached documents in emails might be records as well, and you really need to make sure that you keep the body of the message that transmitted that attachment along with the attachment itself. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense if you say, hey, see this attachment for details, and the attachment is not readily available. The amount of email that we have to deal with really means we need practical solutions for managing it, because it's often very difficult to classify the content or identify who keeps the official copy of it. One thing Secretary of State has done is designate the sender of email as the official copy holder. And that means if I send an email to 20 people, they don't have to keep 20 copies. We just make sure that, if you send the email, you're responsible for filing it and making sure it's in our ERMS system and managed according to the correct retention requirements. We also want people to know what not to keep, because like I said, there are exemptions to public records law. If I email a friend, let's go to lunch, and they said, yeah, let's go out. Those might be on a work email system, but unless they deal with work-related matters, they can probably safely be destroyed. They don't meet the definition of a public record. And spam also falls under that. FYIs fall under that, listserv messages, or event announcements, as long as you don't reply to them, probably do not fall under the definition of public record. Definitely not spam, definitely not unsolicited advertisements, or personal correspondence, or, hey, here's a newspaper clipping from the Oregonian that mentions us. Those are not technically public records either. It's good for an agency to know who's responsible for keeping it. In our case, we designated the sender. And if it's something that I receive from a member of the public and I'm the first contact listed on that email, then as the first recipient of that email from an external sender, I also have the official copy of that. So find out if check to see if your IT department automatically empties deleted items. And if not, you should make sure that you do that periodically, because emails in that trash folder are still discoverable and may have to be turned over in a public records request. If it exists, it can be disclosable. It might have to be handed over if it exists in any form. And if they are allowed to be deleted, if they've met their retention period, make sure to follow through in a timely manner. Also, finally, do yourself and everyone you work with a favor. Make really detailed and useful subject lines. An email with the subject, meeting or hello can easily get confused with other emails. And then you might remember it for about a day, and then in 6 months, and you have a whole pile of non-descriptive subject lines, you're gonna have no idea. You're gonna have to just open every single one and look at each one and classify it then. But instead of just saying meeting, if you title the subject line something like follow up to April 12th meeting about records management, then you're gonna have a much better idea what that message is about. It's gonna be a lot easier to locate it later down the road. A couple more tips about email. Frequently purge your deleted items if there isn't already a policy on it. Useful specific subject lines. And then state archives are proponents of the cleanup tool, which is an Outlook 2010 and later, which allows you to right click on a folder and if you hit that cleanup, which is on this slide here, then it will go through and identify duplicate material and tag them for deletion. I'm thinking of if a colleague and I go back and forth, and we have 6 emails in this thread. The 6th and final email is going to have all of the previously quoted email and all the content and all the metadata. So the 6th one is really the only one you need to keep, and it will weed out the previous 5 and mark them for deletion. You do want to be careful that any attachment that is sent back and forth is also retained, because it might not be retained in that last version. Topic a lot of people talk about these days because agencies are moving towards it is social media, which has, as you can guess, it also can be applied to public records law, but has unique challenges. Is social media public record? So again, does the content meet the public records definition that we looked at earlier from ORS 192? Is this content unique? Is its retention based on the content and the function of the record? So what this means is if you post something to Facebook or Twitter on your public agency site and it doesn't exist anywhere else internally or on a network drive, then you might have Facebook, for example, could have the only official copy of that record. And so what you really want to do is identify records that might not be kept internally on agency equipment and try to rectify that. We'll talk about that more in a second. So managing, there's no requirement, by the way, for organ agencies to leap into social media. Sometimes they do it to engage better with the public. And in that case, a lot have had a lot more success in dealing with it more as a one-way street, or in things like disabling comments on certain things, because if they're inviting the public to comment and the public comments it on Facebook or Twitter, it could conceivably be considered a public comment that would fall under public records law. So before any agency starts to use any social media platform, it really needs to have written policies and procedures that address records use, records access, records retention, and records ownership. Records ownership meaning the agency owns an Instagram feed, for example, and that Instagram feed contains public records that are being managed according to public records law. So every agency should have a policy, and it really needs to have a plan for capturing content posted to those social media platforms, preferably by not having Twitter or Facebook or YouTube be the official copy, but to have a copy of that somewhere under the agency's control. And you can capture that content either with built-in mechanisms. Twitter, for example, does have a pretty good way to export everything that you tweet. There's also external software that can be purchased that will make copies of everything that you post to social media and help you save it locally. But again, like we said, there's no requirement for any agency to use one or any of these social medias. Text messages, instant messages, chat rooms, things like that. So who holds these kinds of messages? It's probably not the agency. It's probably the carrier or the ISP. And how long do they keep them? Nobody can really guess. They might have a policy, but it's definitely not going to be as long as our retention schedules say. It might be 30 days. It might be slightly longer, but you do not want to rely on a private company to hold on to records as long as it says in your retention schedule. So our specific agency, we strongly recommend against using text messages that are on third-party vendors for, detailed or public record material. Our policy is this one in quotes here, and Secretary of State's policy is substantive business-related discussions, are not to take place on text message, SMS, or other mobile messaging applications. So if I'm running late for a meeting or I'm meeting a colleague, I might just say, stuck in traffic, be 10 minutes late. That's not really substantive. What I wouldn't want to do is launch into a long discussion of all the topics we need to talk about at today's meeting. That would probably fall under public records. And what I should really be doing instead of texting it is using my work account for that. It's going to capture that and keep it for the retention period. If I'm just tapping it out on my phone on a third-party mobile device or app or social media, it's probably not going to capture it for the time period that it needs to be. So there are some cases where policy really isn't enough and you just have to use mobile messaging. So after the fact, you can manually forward those messages back to your government email account. And some services do allow you to auto CC that account on all your messages, on all your outgoings, so that will accomplish that as well. There's also mobile device management that can centralize control of what's happening on a phone, whether it's a personal phone or an agency-issued phone. So I was just going to close out today by a quick discussion of some of these overarching issues that we're dealing with. We've already talked about email and social media and mobile, and that's what we're talking about today, but they're not necessarily going to be the same communication technologies in use tomorrow. We as a society, we're always playing catch up with new technologies, even though the core issues remain the same in every new iteration of the technology. So what we really need to do is stop jumping into the new technology because it's new, and only later saying, hey, what about the records created by these new technologies? Here's what we recommend doing. Always make records part of this initial discussion, no matter how seemingly ephemeral that technology is going to be, because almost any kind of technology can create records. And if it does, it can be a major issue if you never thought about that eventuality in advance. It's a great idea to think about the entire life cycle of the records as well as the acceptable use of it. And to think about, in terms of the life cycle of the record, how long are these records going to live in this format or on this platform? What's the retention of the records that we're going to be putting there? Do we have or do we even need a capture strategy? If something meets the definition of a public record, the answer is yes, you do need to have a capture strategy. So what we hope to do is get people thinking about these issues before the technology becomes prevalent and before it's too late to, head off issues that might happen with that. It's great to have conversations between legal, IT, administrative services, and also records officer, records management personnel before purchasing any new information system, any new software, because you'll want to get everyone's heads together and talk about that before you purchase anything new. I am happy to take questions. My contact information is up top here. I'm Matt, and Chris, whose information is also here, is our ORMS administrator. He's happy to take questions or requests for information about the ORMS system, which again is the ERMS system in use at Secretary of State. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
All right. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that everyone in this room has actually responded to a public records request before. Is that true? All right. I did have one presentation that I did where I asked that question at the end, and I learned very late in the game that the whole discussion had been entirely academic, and almost none of the public officials in that room had ever actually had to respond to a public records request. I'm Ginger McCall. I'm the public records advocate for the state of Oregon. In fact, the first public records advocate. I was appointed by the governor last spring to serve a function of providing facilitated dispute resolution on public records here in the state of Oregon, as well as providing training and leading the Public Records Advisory Council, which is tasked with making proposals for changes in policy and law that will improve transparency in the state. So just by way of introduction, I started off my career, I am an attorney. I started my career doing Freedom of Information Act requests, which is public records requests on the federal level. And for 6 years, I worked for a small nonprofit organization focusing on privacy rights and government oversight, where I frequently made FOIA requests to federal agencies, and often had to follow those requests up with litigation in federal court when they weren't fulfilled by the agencies in a timely manner. After 6 years of doing that, I thought that it would be interesting to go and see what the lay of the land actually was on the government side. So from there, I went to go and work for the U.S. Department of Labor, where I then defended FOIA lawsuits. And that was an illuminating experience. The Department of Labor is a fairly well-funded and relatively large agency, and yet it still suffered from a lot of systemic problems that made it very difficult to actually implement the FOIA. Department of Labor oversees the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, which has a large number of small remote offices around the country, Mine Safety Administration, Wage and Hour Division, all of which are usually very small offices, often understaffed, that are located in remote locations, which created a real challenge for responding to public records requests in a timely manner. So I got to see a little bit of what it was like to process public records requests. And from there, I was fortunate enough to be given this opportunity to come here and start this new office up. So without any further introduction, I'll now talk a little bit about how to respond to a public records request. And just as a note, if you are online listening, I would be happy to take your questions. You can email them to me, ginger.mccall@oregon.gov, and I will try to fulfill them in a timely manner, probably at the end of this presentation, since I can't be checking my email throughout. But if folks in the room have questions, feel free to step in throughout the conversation and ask those questions. So Oregon has a fairly broad public records law. Every person has the right to inspect any public record of a public body in this state, except as otherwise expressly provided. So what that means is that you don't have to be a citizen to make a public records request in the state of Oregon. You don't even have to be a resident of the state of Oregon. Anyone can make that request, including people, corporations, law firms, associations, or a member or committee of the Legislative Assembly. And a public record, as Matt has already said, is a document that contains information regarding government business. It's prepared, owned, used, or retained by government, and it can be in any form, electronic or paper. Oregon's public records law also takes a fairly broad stance on what constitutes a public body. This includes state agencies. It also includes localities, cities, counties, special districts. And unlike the Federal Freedom of Information Act, it does include elected officials. And those elected officials include both state-level elected officials as well as local elected officials like city council members. There are some obligations that the requester has under the law. A request can generally be made in any form. A request can even be made with a phone call. But it should be sufficient to identify the records being sought. If it's not, then that's a great opportunity for you to reach out to that requester and have a conversation with them to clarify the request. I would recommend doing that as soon as possible after you receive the request so you can move things along in a timely manner. You can limit the ways that you will receive requests if you have a public records policy, which you are in fact required to have under the law. So if you have that policy in place and it's publicly available, you can say to the requester, hey, I know you sent this request to X email address, but if you could please send it to Y email address in accordance with our public records policy, we would appreciate it. This is to try to maintain proper processes within an agency and also to sort of tame the chaos. As a public body, it makes sense for you to have a centralized email address through which you'll accept public records requests, so that just any email that's sent to any official at your public body doesn't necessarily constitute a public records request, because then it's difficult to track those requests and difficult to meet your deadlines. But I would encourage you to use this provision in the spirit of openness and not as a way to frustrate public records requesters or to make it more difficult or create hurdles for public records requests. So a quick quiz. Which of the following are public records under ORS? The work-related emails of a Department of Corrections warden. Public record? Yes, public record. I like the thumbs up. Yes, a public record isn't just a traditional paper document. A public record can also be an email. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. It can be a Word document. It can be any number of digital documents. It doesn't have to be in physical format. Photographs, let's say physical photographs, of a workplace accident taken by an Oregon Occupational Health and Safety Administration inspector. Yes, photographs also fall under the law, whether they're digital or physical photographs. Again, the definition of record is fairly expansive in this law. Personal photographs stored in the hard drive of a city employee's work computer. So Kim's vacation photos that we just saw in the last presentation, everything that's in that folder, does that count as a public record? No, that's right, because it has to contain information regarding government business. So just because something happens to be physically housed in your office or physically housed on your work computer does not necessarily convert it into being a public record. It has to contain information about government business. Although, as Matt emphasized, and I will re-emphasize here, this will be a theme in this presentation, it is best to not commingle the personal with business matters. So to the full extent possible, try to not commingle those two things because it tends to create some confusion under the public records law. Text messages regarding a proposed new policy exchanged between city officials on their work cell phones. Yes, that is a public record. Although, again, as Matt said, we highly discourage the use of text messages for substantive conversations because it is quite fraught from a public records standpoint and a record retention standpoint. An email discussion between two city employees, both using their personal email accounts, discussing a potential city budget decision. Yes, as many of our former and current public officials have learned, just because you're using a personal email account doesn't mean that it's not a public record. And again, we discourage the commingling of the personal and the private. A record that could have been destroyed 3 years ago per the archive's record retention policy, but was accidentally retained. Yep, if you've still got it, you've still got to provide it. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you stay in line with your record retention schedules. The personal medical bills of a county employee, which he was storing in his work office. No, that's right. Just because it happens to be in your office doesn't necessarily mean that it's a public record. Again, it has to contain information regarding government business. So here in Oregon, until a few years ago, we didn't actually have any deadlines for our public records law. But the legislature in recent years finally created some deadlines. The first is that you have to acknowledge a request within 5 business days. So business days doesn't include Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays. I did receive an interesting question when I was doing training on the other side of the state. It was from someone who worked in an office that's typically only operational and open for 3 days of the week. So they asked me, if our office is only typically open from Monday to Wednesday, are Thursday and Friday still business days for our purposes for responding to records requests? And the answer is yes, because that is explicitly defined in the statute. Thursday and Friday, even if your office is only typically open Monday through Wednesday, would still be considered business days. Under the new deadlines, you have to complete the response to the request in 15 business days, or if that's completely impracticable, let's say that your office is understaffed, you have a big backlog, it's a very broad request, you have to at least provide a reasonable estimated date of completion within 15 business days. So completing a response to a request, which is the ideal within that 15 business days, includes providing all non-exempt records and citing any exemptions applied, or if the record isn't yours, informing the requester that you're not the custodian of that record. This is important to note. If you are going to apply exemptions, you do have to make sure that you let the requester know which exemptions it is that you're applying. I recommend, as a best practice here, that you also include a brief explanation of why that exemption applies. If you do that, it tends to just create more of a trusting relationship with that requester, and it also allows them to do a more informed evaluation of whether or not they want to appeal. If you don't explain, then they may just appeal reflexively. If you explain, then they have an opportunity to look at it and think, you know, that actually seems kind of reasonable, maybe I won't appeal. Sure, I have a quick question in the room.
When does the deadline start for a requester not initially going through the appropriate channel for the request? So if the policy is to submit it to X email and they send it to Y email, when does it start?
The deadline, the question was when the deadline starts to run. And the deadline starts to run when the proper official who's been designated to receive public records requests, or the proper channel to receive public records requests, actually receives that request. So when I talk to requesters, one recommendation I give to them is to make sure that they're sending the request to the right person, because there is a fair amount of delay that gets built in there if you send your request to the wrong official, even if it's in the right office. So it starts when you receive that request, when whoever the person who is designated receives that request. So under Oregon's public records law, you can charge fees for public records requests, although you are not permitted to charge fees to make a profit. You can only charge fees that are designed to recoup the actual costs and expenses that you incur in responding to that request. That can include staff and supervisor time for gathering records, time that you spend segregating out exempt material, and time you spend copying. So searching, reviewing, making duplications, all of that you can charge fees for. This does include attorney time that's spent reviewing the records and redacting or segregating exempt material, but it doesn't include attorney time that's spent researching which exemptions would apply. So that's sort of a gray area. Because the cost of attorneys is so high, I recommend that unless you really, really, really need to use them, that you not use attorneys and pass those fees on to the requester. Most requesters can't afford to pay those sorts of fees. And to the extent that documents can be reviewed and redacted by someone who's at a lower pay level within your staff, I would highly recommend that you do that. Public bodies are also strongly encouraged to adopt DAS's proposed statewide policy on fees. That is available online. This is not mandatory for you, and I will make a few important caveats on that. So this policy is still a draft policy. I expect that we'll be seeing some fairly substantial changes to it before it's rolled out for notice and comment, which will also likely result in other changes. Specifically around the issue of fee reductions and fee waivers, I suspect that this is an evolving policy right now. So stay tuned on that. Probably wait until the agency finalizes that rule if you are going to use it as a guideline. But for now, it's a helpful thing to just look at and be aware of the way that this fee structure looks. Again, even when it's finalized, it's not necessarily going to be mandatory to local entities or other public bodies. This will only be mandatory to state agencies, but it is a useful jumping off point. It's also helpful to keep in mind as you look at these rates that they are meant to be a ceiling and not a floor. This is supposed to be the very maximum that a state agency can charge for public records requests per hour. So you can see that they break it down by different levels of staff, so different expense levels, clerical, managerial, or professional. They also have different rates for copies, media, and postage, and then some additional cost considerations. So many public bodies generally waive the first 30 minutes of staff time for all public records requests. This is a great best practice. It promotes transparency. It's also efficient from a bureaucratic standpoint. It means that you're not going to spend a lot of time calculating fees and sending out a bill for fees and trying to collect those fees for a relatively minimal amount of money. Further reduction and waiver is available where making the record available primarily benefits the public. So this is usually when you're dealing with a news media requester. You want to look into whether or not that person has a platform to disseminate information, whether or not they have an intention to disseminate information, and whether or not this is the kind of information that would actually be of interest to the public. And you do have a fair amount of discretion here to grant or deny waiver requests, but you have to act reasonably. As a general matter, I would say if you're dealing with a media requester, this is a scenario where you would want to waive or reduce fees. Pretty much by default, because those are requesters who are in the business of disseminating information to the public. They're usually working in the public interest, and those are the kind of core of the requesters that the legislature envisioned when they created this provision. And it's a provision that was meant to encourage transparency, a provision that was meant to make more information available to the public as broadly as possible. So if you're charging fees, you have to provide advance notice with a fee estimate if your estimated fee is going to exceed $25. You can require advance payment of estimated fees, but again, as a best practice, I would say you probably only want to do that if you're dealing with someone that you have a reason to believe isn't necessarily going to pay those fees. For example, someone who has a history of non-payment. So, quick quiz on fee waivers and reductions. Would you waive or reduce fees in the following scenarios? Why or why not? A reporter for the Oregonian who has made a public records request to the Oregon Health Authority for email communications regarding Salem's recent water crisis. Would you waive or reduce? Yeah, this is a pretty strong argument for a waiver or reduction. You're working, this is a reporter, someone who is in the business of disseminating information to the public. They are likely going to use this information to benefit the public and inform them about government activities. The water crisis itself was a very strong, had a very strong public interest hook. As someone who lives in Salem, I was very interested in the safety of our drinking water. And I think everyone else in that community is as well. So this is a very strong argument for a public interest reduction or waiver. A member of the public who's been the victim of police violence and is now requesting the completed internal affairs investigation. This is a tougher one, right? Because there are interests on both sides, right? So on one hand, this person is the victim of police misconduct, which is a strong, we have a strong public interest in ensuring that there's accountability with the police. Also, I think the public has a strong interest generally in police misconduct, especially right now. But on the other hand, this person is a victim and may be using it for their own personal purposes, like a civil lawsuit or something like that. So this is a moment where it would be very helpful to call the requester up and ask them some follow-up questions. As a general matter, when you receive a public records request, it's not appropriate to call the requester up and say, who are you and what are you going to use this for? But if they ask you for a fee reduction or fee waiver, or in the context, as we'll talk about later, with exemptions under the public records law, those are instances where it is appropriate to follow up and say, who are you and what do you plan to use this for? So in this scenario, you might want to call that person up and ask them, why do you need these documents? Are you planning on taking them out to the public? Maybe this person has a tie to a reporter. Maybe they have a blog online where they're going to disseminate this information. Maybe they're involved in a pretty public activism effort against police misconduct. All of those things would weigh in favor of a public interest reduction or waiver. But you can only get to that if you actually reach out to that requester and have that conversation. So it's important to do that. And also, I will say that moment when you're providing the requester with the fee estimate is another great moment to reach out to the requester and have a conversation. If you look at a request and it's super broad and it's going to take you a long time and a lot of money to process that request, and you come up with an estimate that's pretty high, call the requester and have a conversation with them. I think phone calls are a far more effective communication method than a letter or an email. But have a conversation with them, explain, here's what we're looking at, here's the search that we're doing. Is there a way that we can work together to narrow this request? Most requesters are interested in getting their documents quickly and cheaply, so a lot of them are incentivized to narrow the request. If you talk to them honestly, most reasonable people would be interested in working to narrow a request. It's certainly a good use of your time to reach out and have that conversation and do it as early as possible. I rarely see requesters who are more upset than someone who submits a public records request, waits 6 months, they hear nothing from the public body, and then after 6 months, they receive a fee estimate for $500. They're not going to be happy. Do it sooner rather than later, and make it a collaborative conversation whenever possible about how can we work together to get you the documents that you want, but to create as narrow of a request as possible. So, third scenario, an attorney at a small plaintiff side law firm who's seeking a fatality investigation file from the Oregon Occupational Health and Safety Administration for use in a wrongful death case. Yeah, probably not in this one, though we may sympathize very much with someone who was harmed in the workplace. It's a very sympathetic cause, but this is a request by an attorney who's probably going to be using this for his or her own commercial purposes as part of a civil lawsuit where money is at stake. And attorneys working in civil lawsuits are usually not going to take those documents out to the public. They're usually just going to keep it as part of their lawsuit. So same probably for the plaintiff side law firm and the defense side in that case, that you would not necessarily want to waive or reduce fees. So under ORS 192.3247, every public body is required to have a public records policy. A brief survey that I did of state agencies revealed that most of them do not necessarily have one, certainly not one that's available online. This policy has to exist and has to be publicly available, which I interpret to mean in this day and age that it's up on your website. It has to explain how you accept requests and identify the name and address of a person to whom requests can be sent, so probably your records officer or public information officer. And this piece is particularly important because when I do presentations and trainings for the public, one of the things that I always tell them is, you know, if you have a question about how to draft a request, instead of just shooting off a request for all records related to X, Y, and Z thing, which is going to take forever to process, pick up the phone and call the agency and have a conversation with the agency about how to create a narrower request than that, and where to look, where to direct that request. It saves everyone a lot of time. But requesters can only do that if they can actually find your name and phone number on the website. So not only is it a good idea, but it is in fact required by law that every public body, and that includes local public bodies, have this information publicly available. This policy also has to include the amounts of and the manner of calculating fees for records. So that would look something like that DAS fees policy that we just looked at a minute ago. So this is an example of a public records policy that I really like. There are a lot of things that I like about this policy. First, there's a move in government right now toward what's called proactive disclosure. And proactive disclosure is when a government body puts documents up online for the public to view without ever having actually received a public records request for those documents. You look at the document sets that you have, you anticipate which ones, you know, historically and in the future will probably be the target of a lot of public records requests and have a strong public interest, and then you put them up online proactively. Oregon has two big websites for that, oregon.gov/transparency and data.oregon.gov. So this policy tells potential requesters if there's a document that you want, you should check in these two places first, which is good. I like to think that that saves them at least some amount of time processing public records requests where the documents have already been posted up online. And then they say, if you can't find what you're looking for, they have several methods to submit a public records request. The first is using a submission form, which I really like. I think submission forms are my favorite way of asking for information. Not everyone, however, likes submission forms. So for those people, there's the option of emailing a request. Now, they have a link here where you can look for the proper administrator of the division that you would want to send your request to. I think that's great. It will probably saves the agency some time if folks send their request directly to the right administrator, then it doesn't have to bounce around the agency. But a lot of times there's an asymmetry of information, and requesters don't necessarily know what the right administrator or division or component of a public body is. So this policy also allows for a sort of general submission, either by phone or by email. And for populations that might not have access to the internet or access to email. I know at least incarcerated populations, it's often very difficult for them to have access to email. So there's the option here in this policy of submitting a request by snail mail, which I think is very helpful. So aside from that, they also have a link to the full public records request policy. That policy outlines the fees that DAS can charge, as well as the processes that the agency uses to fulfill requests. And they have a frequently asked questions section, which again, I like to hope optimistically saves them at least a little bit of time answering redundant questions about public records requests. So as a general matter, Oregon's public records law is a law that is in favor of disclosure. It has a presumption of disclosure. However, there are exceptions to that. An exception to a public records law is generally called an exemption. And an exemption allows a public body to withhold information which would otherwise be subject to the public records law. So documents that are public records but can be lawfully withheld. Oregon has a lot of exemptions, I think over 570, and the legislature is still churning them out every session reliably. Many of those exemptions are included in ORS 192, provisions 345 and 355. Many of the exemptions are subject to some kind of balancing test. So a balancing test creates a scenario where you, as a public official, would look at the factors weighing in favor of disclosure versus the factors weighing in favor of confidentiality or withholding information. You weigh those factors against each other and you make a decision about whether or not you're going to withhold the documents. So under 345, all of the exemptions in that provision of the law, the balancing test is records are exempt unless the public interest requires disclosure. So it's a public interest balancing test, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. 355, each exemption includes its own balancing test, and it's right there in the text of the statute what the balancing test is, what the interests are that you should be considering when you're deciding whether or not to disclose that information. Oregon's public records law also sweeps in all other Oregon statutes or federal statutes which exempt information from disclosure, and there are a lot of those as well. Now, notably, though there are over 570 exemptions, there is not an exemption for information that will embarrass us. That is not an exemption. These exemptions were not designed to hide agencies from scrutiny or oversight or to prevent embarrassment on the part of a government agency. So there are many exemptions. That is not one of them. So 345, again, same balancing test, balancing confidentiality interests versus the public interest in disclosure. But presumption is always in favor of disclosure. You can look up the full list of documents that would be exempt. You can look at 345 and see what documents those are. These are some of the most frequently cited exemptions. Records pertaining to litigation, trade secrets, criminal investigatory information, or personnel disciplinary information. If you want a full list of all of Oregon's 570 plus exemptions, that list is now available. The legislature required in the 2017 changes to the law that the Attorney General track all of the exemptions and make a list of exemptions available online. And I believe I have that URL later on in this presentation. But you can look that up online, and I would highly recommend that you spend a little bit of time perusing that. You can usually tell at first glance, 90% of the time whether or not you're ever going to actually have to use one of those exemptions. So a public interest, for the purpose of this balancing test, is information that facilitates public understanding of how government business is conducted. It has to be of value to the public at large and not just to a particular person at a particular time. And a court of appeals has held that if a government action attracts significant attention or controversy, that may suggest a heightened public interest. So if you've read about it in the newspaper, if you've heard about it on TV, if people have been discussing it around town, probably that's a matter of heightened public interest for the purposes of these exemptions. 355 has another long laundry list of exemptions. These ones, again, don't have a blanket balancing test, but you can read the text of the exemption to find out what interests you would balance in deciding whether or not to disclose the information. Sometimes the burden is on the government body to justify non-disclosure. Sometimes it's on the requester to justify why information should be disclosed. There's, again, a long list there in 355, but these are some of the most frequently cited exemptions. Internal advisory communications, personal information, public employee information, confidential submissions, and then the catch-all provision, which includes information that's exempt elsewhere under the Oregon law or elsewhere under federal law or regulation. Now, there is an exception to these exemptions. So the exemptions are the exception to the public records law. The exception to the exception is that records more than 25 years old are generally not exempt anymore. However, several exceptions deep, the exception to the exception to the exception to the public records law, medical records, sealed records, custody records, and student records can always be exempt. That 25-year cutoff does not apply to those records. So if you want a full list of exemptions, here's the URL for the Attorney General's website. If you're interested in reading more about a particular exemption, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the Oregon DOJ Public Records Manual. That manual has a lot of really useful information about the exemptions. You can read about what exemptions apply in what factual scenarios, what the courts have found, what district attorneys have found across the state. And so you can get more information and a better sense of whether or not an exemption will apply in your particular case from that DOJ Public Records Manual. And you can find that on the DOJ's website. One important caveat about that manual is that the last edition of it was published in 2014. Most of the information about the exemptions is still current. The exemptions are still current. Most of the law around them is current. But the Public Records Manual doesn't have any information about the deadlines that were created in 2017. It's not going to have any information about the creation of my office because those things happened after the publication of the manual. However, I have it in good faith that the DOJ is working diligently on an update to that manual, which should be available sometime early next year. So stay tuned. But for the time being, it is still a very useful source of information for public records exemptions and other details about the law. So if there is a disagreement over public records, what happens next? So the first option is alternative dispute resolution through my office. And my office offers alternative dispute resolution at the request of either the requester or a state agency, or potentially a requester or a city, although cities are not required to engage with my office. A state agency, if the requester requests alternative dispute resolution, the state agency has to participate in that in good faith, but local entities are not required under the law to participate. However, if you would like someone to step in on your behalf, if you'd like someone to try to mediate a dispute that you're having with a public records requester, I would be very happy to do that. I provide formal mediation, but also a lot of informal dispute resolution and assistance. Informal dispute resolution is usually just me picking up the phone and calling the requester saying, you know, I'm here to help you. How can we figure out a way to work this out? How can we narrow your request? How can we work with the agency to find you a resolution that you're happy with? I also provide advice and assistance on the law. If you have questions about the public records law and your obligations under it, please do feel free to reach out to me. I'm very interested in helping you. If you don't have a public records policy in place, I would be very interested in helping you draft one up because, again, that is required under the law. But I'm here to assist with that, so you can contact my office. I'm here, and also I have a deputy now, Todd Albert, who has been helping me, and Todd will also be there to assist you. So if I can't get the resolution that someone wants, then there's another option, and that's a more formalized review of a denial of a request or of a fee issue. If the records in question are a state agency's records, then the requester can go to the Attorney General and file an appeal with the Attorney General. And then if the requester or the agency doesn't get the response that they want from the Attorney General, they can take the matter to court. If the records belong to an elected official, not surprisingly, elected officials have set it up so that the only recourse for a requester in that scenario is to go straight to court. That's the only appeal avenue. For local governments and non-elected officials on the county, city, special district, all other levels, the correct body to offer that review would be the district attorney. So the requester would appeal to the district attorney, and then if either the requester or the public body is unhappy with that outcome, they can appeal to the circuit court. So the way that looks is the requester petitions the AG or the DA. The AG or DA has to act within 7 days. Notably, AGs and district attorneys can force public bodies to show them the documents in question so that the AG or DA can make an informed decision, and they can order release of documents. In this scenario, the public body would bear the burden of proof. So you would have to show why it was you were charging fees or why it was you were withholding documents or not responding to a public records request. Judicial review is the next step, and this again can be done by either the public body or the requester. So if the requester appeals to the district attorney orders you to disclose the documents and you still feel that that's not the correct legal conclusion, you can then appeal to to the court. The burden will remain, however, on the public body. And notably, if the requester prevails in that scenario, the requester can be granted attorney's fees and costs, which can be quite substantial. When I was litigating under the Freedom of Information Act, which has a similar provision, those fees at the end, if it was a long lawsuit, 2 years or so, which was that's actually a fairly short lawsuit in federal court, could be, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. So for one lawsuit. So it gets expensive. Those attorney's fees really add up. So it's a useful thing to keep in mind if you're dealing with a requester and you think that they may litigate. So again, my office has 3 statutory duties: facilitating dispute resolution, providing training like this, and leading the Public Records Advisory Council. And please do feel free to reach out if you have questions. If you're having an issue with a particular requester, I would be happy to assist you with that. Some general communication recommendations. Communicate early and often. And to the full extent possible, make that communication be via phone instead of over email or letter. There's more opportunity to have a meaningful exchange via phone than there is to over email or letter. And again, try to do that as early as possible, because most of the frustration that I see on the requester side is due to delay or just non-responsiveness. The feeling of facing a giant bureaucracy or a faceless bureaucracy where they don't have any accountability. They don't even know who to reach out to. They've submitted this request and it feels like it went down a black hole. What is happening with my request? So you can help to prevent those feelings by reaching out early and having good communication with the requester. Use de-escalation strategies. There are some really good customer service de-escalation strategy tutorials online. I would recommend that you take a little bit of time to look at those and get a sense of what you can do to de-escalate. A lot of times at the core of a public records request is some feeling of grievance, or someone who feels that they've been done wrong, not even necessarily by the government. Maybe it was their neighbor, maybe it was some member of the city council, maybe it was someone else that they interacted with that they feel has wronged them. And so they're trying to use the public records law as a way to vindicate that. So there's often a lot of emotion that's tied up in that, which is why things can go from 0 to 10 pretty quickly. So to the extent that you can use de-escalation strategies to keep things cool and rational, I'd highly recommend it. And again, customer service de-escalation strategies are particularly useful here. And look for creative solutions. Maybe you're dealing with someone who's made a public records request that falls squarely within an exemption. But if you call them up on the phone and have a conversation, you may be able to find them a way to get them at least some of the documents that they want without running squarely into that exemption. So work on it as though you're on a team and you're trying to come up with an outcome that will be suitable for both of you. How can we work together to craft a narrow request? How can we work together to craft a request that's not going to be exempt? I think a lot of requesters will react positively to that. So I have some feedback questions here from you. I would love to hear from you now, or if you want to shoot me an email later. The feedback that I get from you helps me to provide better trainings. It helps me to know what I should be training government officials on, but also what I should be training the public on. If you're seeing perennial issues that you think it would be helpful for me to touch on in my public trainings, I would love to hear about that. Or if there are particular exemptions you're using that I should talk about more in these government trainings, I would also really like to hear about that. So any information that you provide me would be very helpful. And here is my contact information. And again, if you have questions, if you want someone to reach out to a requester on your behalf, I would be very happy to do that. Feel free to contact me anytime. Does anyone have any questions right now? I'm just going to pull up my email just to make sure I didn't get any questions from online. I don't see anything yet. So I think that wraps up my portion, unless there's some questions in the room. Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you. I'm just going to leave the contact information slide up for the folks online. Great. Thanks.